Well, I wanted to run through a few ideas with you to begin today that have to do with the book of Leviticus generally. And I wanted to begin with a story that actually comes from a couple of decades ago when I was working at a camp. I think this was I was in my early 20s, so it was a few decades ago, actually. Yeah. So I was working at this camp, and it was this marvelous place in Western New York. I love camps. I love the opportunity to be invested in a place with young people. And there was this place in the campground that you could go and get fresh spring water. Fresh spring is the best water I've ever tasted in my whole life. Well, week after week, we would take our campers there throughout the day, and we would be able to gain fresh spring water. At some point, however, early on in the summer experience, there was a time during which we all became deathly ill. And I mean ill on both ends, as it relates to that. So it was a constant thing too. I mean, there was no let-up of this sickness. Come to find out, as they had been building the camp, they had taken the repository for wastewater and sewage and placed it above the spring. It leaked. And you can imagine, as we received the reports back, fecal coliform, and the report was too many to count. I mention that as a story, not to invade your enjoyment of those donut holes. But to make the point of what we're talking about here concerning Leviticus, and that is the concern for sanitation. Another story, very interesting. In the 14th century, if anybody recalls this in their history lessons from high school or college, the Black Plague. This was about the middle of the 14th century. And of course, you remember the story of this, that European folks were literally throwing waste out their windows. Literally, sewage ran in the streets. And of course, because of this, there was a great opportunity, not great in a positive sense, of getting illness and disease. And tens of millions of people died. Well, guess who didn't die? The Jews. Guess why the Jews didn't die? Because they had sanitation practices. And guess what the other Europeans did to the Jews? They attacked them with pitchforks because they believed they were satanic and demonic, because nothing was hurting them. Isn't that amazing? They were practicing Hebraic law, coming right out of the Pentateuch, specifically in places like Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. All of the sanitation was taking place, but they were being attacked because they weren't becoming sick in this awful plague. However, I should also be quick to add that the issue of separating drinking water from wastewater is a recent advancement in the West. I was just having dinner with somebody this week. I was in Columbus, Ohio, met with him, and he was talking about the distended abdomens of young people on the Amazon River because of the parasites that invade them, because the Amazon is not only used for their drinking water, but also wastewater. So when you stop to consider this, we have in the West, and specifically in this country, only had clean water for about 100 years. And even less than that when you stop to consider the need to keep it from contamination. We really haven't been with clean water all that long. Outside the camp, clean, burning, and bathing are repetitious actions to combat disease in Leviticus. Should it be something perhaps we might want to pay attention to? I think maybe. Sanitation is a big deal in Leviticus. Here's another example of these universal principles. In 1846, a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis showed that hand hygiene is the best defense against the spread of disease. I cannot tell you, when I call my mom every week, I cannot tell you how many times she says to me during any given conversation, "Have you washed your hands? Are you washing your hands?" Now, my mom is 84. She's been a nurse for 60 plus years, and she's still concerned that her son, at age 60, is washing his hands. There you go. That's how important this is, folks. Washing, purification, isolation, and quarantine originated in Leviticus 13. So we shouldn't be really very surprised by this when we consider that there was a great concern on God's behalf for his people. When you had an illness, when there was some awfulness going on in the camp, some death, all of that stuff took place outside the camp. In fact, so specifically, this is in the book of Deuteronomy, that in the book of Deuteronomy we are found to be told how latrines were to be dug outside the camp. Now, this is not some desire on Mark's part to make this an unpleasant, uncomfortable session of teaching. This is simply telling you what Scripture teaches. Why is that? Because Leviticus is a treasure trove of universal principles that need to be applied. And in some places around the world still are not being applied today. In fact, by the way, from what I read online this week about doctors, hospitals are still struggling making doctors wash their hands. Don't read any of that stuff before you go into surgery. Okay? Bloodletting. Oh, here we go. For over 2 millennia, the concept of bloodletting was an acceptable practice into the late 1800s in this country. Isn't that amazing? And yet Leviticus says that the life of the flesh is in the blood. Gee, how about that? Maybe we should actually pay attention to Leviticus and say, maybe it has something to teach us about things we should and shouldn't do. How about this one? Land use. Here we go. I'll never forget. I was listening to PBS. You know, I do occasionally watch documentaries, some really great stuff there. And I'll never forget this one. The voiceover intones, and in just the last couple of 100 years, we have discovered that letting the land lay fallow is good. And I'm yelling at the television set, haven't you read Leviticus? Do some research. Thousands of years ago, people were doing, a couple 100 years, man, come on. Read a book, Leviticus 25. There it is, land use, come on. Here's one more, diet. Current dietary thought is a recent development. Now, I know I've given you some pretty gross pictures of fat up there. But my point in suggesting this is that guess what God did in Leviticus? He said, burn the fat. Gee, I wonder why he said that. Because he knew this side of 20th and 21st century medical knowledge that things like arteriosclerosis and cancer and diabetes are tied directly to the ingestion of fat and sugars. And so we have all of these nice, really cool charts, you know, and all this stuff about how we should eat and what should we eat and how much of whatever we should eat. And then there's, of course, they've added recently the whole diet to exercise issue. And you wonder why, by the way, that there's no emphasis on exercise in the Bible. They didn't need to. They walked everywhere. So there was constant exercise. There was no need to, yes, make sure that you go 24-hour gym down at My Fitness. No. None of that stuff. Burn the fat, don't eat the fat, Leviticus 3 and 7. These were anticipatory laws. The idea of universal practical truths that originated in God's Word that give us the kind of understandings that we have today. But apart, really, from Leviticus, it took us an awful long time to get there by ourselves. And honestly, quite frankly, if it wasn't for Scripture, we would certainly have a dearth of understanding of how to live in this life properly. So one of the things that's very important to understand this book of Leviticus, and I've recorded all of this stuff for you on the handouts if you're so inclined, is that the word holy. Now the word holy in Hebrew is a word that literally means to cut or to separate. So oftentimes this word was used as the basis for a covenant. You would cut animals in two after you've killed them, and you would walk between them. This is a very famous picture in Genesis chapter 15, for instance, where God actually does this for his people. Well, that's the cultural background to this concept of holiness, but it also means to separate out. To separate out, to be different from, to be distinctive. Now let me just point out something really important here, and I didn't have time to really deal with this except to make a comment about it. When we go into Second Testament, into New Testament, what we discover over and over and over again is that there is a constant emphasis on who we should separate from. And guess what? It's not from the unbeliever. How about that? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5, 9 to 11, and 1 Corinthians 6, 9 to 11, I want you to separate from all these people doing these things. not meaning at all those who are unbelievers. What he means is the folks that you separate from are those who say they're Christians, but they do all of these things. And the concept that is rehearsed through Timothy and Titus and James and Peter over and over and over again is any kind of separation is between those who claim the name and continue to sin. This concept, however, of distinctiveness in the Hebrew and specifically in the book of Leviticus is how are my people going to stand out? And that same kind of message is heard today. There's nothing new really from what it meant in Leviticus to what it means for us today. This distinctive God then that we serve, the question becomes, when we read some of the things that I'll just briefly mention here, are we judging him by our standards or by his? So for instance, in Leviticus chapter 10, God kills a priest because he doesn't offer the sacrifice in the proper way. Why is this? Because he has been told that this is the way he's to offer the sacrifice, and because he didn't, this was the immediate consequence for this. And why was this? Because he held a position of responsibility. Leviticus 20, cursing one's parents meant death. The reason for this is because you are going against not only God's law, but this is an affront to God. And Leviticus 24, same thing for blasphemy. One of the key things, another side note here that's really rather important, when we read these kinds of things in First Testament teaching, remember that we're reading about a people group that was tied to the physical land, and that this was a people group that was continually concerned about the physicalities of life. That is not necessarily the case now in Second Testament, New Testament understandings. And so there have been some shifts in all of that, but nonetheless, I really do think that we still have a real problem with the question that I've lodged here, and that is, do we judge God by our standards or by his? Is holiness, his distinctiveness, an issue of, gee, I wish he was more tame and tolerant and nice, or is it really an issue of our own rebellion? So, is our problem with God our own lack of restraint or our own rebellion against authority? And we're going to come back to that concept of restraint over and over and over again in this particular lesson. So if you remember this, perhaps those of you who have been here the whole time with this, we talked about the geography of Leviticus and how important it is. We talked about Israel being placed literally in a hot box between the great superpowers of the day. In order for people to get through to the other superpowers, they had to go through literally Israel. We talked about why God placed his people there. It was a matter of faith. They had to have faith and trust in what God was going to do for them. What's important here in Leviticus in this regard is this concept, however, that God doesn't expect us to change our environment, our schools, and our government. What he expects us to do is to conform to his change and therefore be a testimony of change to the rest of the culture. I wanted to note in particular, I wanted to read this passage from Leviticus 18, 1-5. It's one of those passages that unfortunately doesn't get much airtime, but it is really important as it relates to how we understand not just this concept, but the whole of Leviticus and understanding where folks have come from and where they're going to. So God speaks to Moses saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they did in the land of Egypt, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I'm bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You will follow my rules. Keep my statutes, walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord." If we did any kind of further research or understanding about Egypt versus Canaan, the general idea is that Canaan was a ton worse than Egypt. So here's just an example of this. Money, sex, and power has been a problem for us ever since Genesis 3. We'll talk about that all the way, the rest of the way through this presentation. But I wanted you to note in particular this difference between Egypt and Canaan. God is basically saying in Leviticus 18, you think it was bad in Egypt? They had 400 gods in their pantheon. There were thousands of gods in Canaan. God after God after God. Why? Because people were literally making them out of the dirt as they were creating them, out of the wood after they were chopping down their trees. You think it was bad in Egypt? Wait till you get to Canaan. What is the point? That God would place his people in such a place that they would be up against it, as it were. Up against such odds. Up against an awful environment. How do we understand that? I would like to suggest that environment is not the problem. If we say that our surroundings are the source of our problem, we're suggesting there's no need for this internal change. There's no need for a salvation from sin. So often what happens to us is that we tend to begin to blame everything else out there. You know, cultural ideas, or certain persons or personalities, certain events that take place, certain institutions. Pick something that you don't like. Whatever it is, that's not the problem. As I've told my students for years and years and years, the problem is not out there. The problem is in here. The problem is with me. It starts here first. So, Leviticus 18, 1-5 really sets the stage for understanding how we're coming from a bad place to a worse place and why environment isn't really the issue. The issue is how are we going to respond internally to the God who has given us these statutes to follow. So, this is going to come as no great shock to anybody. I mean, you've seen these faces probably for the last 10 days or so, coming out of Hollywood. These faces are the faces of those who have now confessed or have been brought up on charges or whatever the case might be about all of their sexual relations with other people in Hollywood. Very bad stuff. But what I'm really interested in is in noticing how the culture identifies this, or how the culture speaks to this issue, and then how Scripture speaks to this issue. Notice when you read these kinds of accounts, you're going to read this over and over again. Folks are going into rehab, they're going into treatment, therapy for sex addiction. These are medical and psychological concepts, and so the idea is to shift the conditions outside of one's control and make it now a disease. Everything is out, all the problems are outside of me. I bear no moral accountability for whatever it is that I have done. This is what our culture preaches, and this is what we expect to see from folks like this. So we shouldn't be surprised at this. Our culture really values the external because they really don't want any kind of responsibility for that which is inside of us. Leviticus distinctiveness, however, says that the problem begins internally, and that that's where we ought to focus our attention. So think about Hollywood revelations from this vantage point. We do have the same problem. Before we get all uppity and think, boy, you know, look at us, aren't we good? Forget about it, man. We are just as bad, and the problem of ours is theirs and vice versa. The need for internal change is the same. Nothing changes. We share the same solution. The lack of internal restraint means there's more external restraint. So what happens when you don't control yourself? Somebody else is going to control you. The problem, of course, with the multiplicity of laws in any nation is that the people themselves cannot control themselves. That's why there's a proliferation of law. And one more, we share the same result, the consequences for our actions. So whatever it is that we've done, whatever these things are, there will always be consequences for it. And gee, what do these three things sound like? Vaguely, Leviticus. How about that? In fact, I would like to point you just quickly to the back of the handout, just to point this out. I've given there on the back side the consequences of sin, the principles derived from Leviticus 26. Obviously, in a session like this, in a classroom setting like this, we don't have time to go through all of these points. But I highly recommend that you go through and read Leviticus 26 and get a sense of these 13 major principles of the consequences of sin. Because what we're seeing in the headlines every single day, it's no different. Nothing's changed. Everything is the same. And the reason is because we are human beings, fallen people, no better than anybody else. And the opportunity we have to understand Leviticus helps us to understand better how to live in this life. So, a few things that we've already talked about, and I'm going to run through some of them rather quickly, mostly because I've talked about sacrifices and priests a couple of weeks ago. But I wanted you to notice in particular concerning the sacrifices. The worshiper was the one responsible to slit the throat of the sheep. Now that gives personal accountability to the problem. That is, you have to do the sacrifice yourself. You have to go through the dirty work of actually doing this. Not only that, but this burning of flesh, which was constant, it's kind of like this olfactory reminder. Oh yeah, I'm a sinner. Every single time you are smelling burnt flesh, this is what's going through your mind. I'm a sinner. I'm a sinner. I have to remember that. These are things that God is teaching. And notice, of course, that in comparison to the rest of the world, the rest of the known ancient world of the time, there was no frenzy. There was no prostitution, which is, by the way people used to do this. When they had sins that they wanted to absolve themselves of, or they wanted some kind of rite of passage for the crops that they were going to be hopefully harvesting soon, they would go and into prostitutes, male and female prostitutes, and this was principally part of the religious ceremony of forgiveness and sacrifice. There you go. This is what was normal. Fertility rites, human sacrifice were also included. Certainly totally different and distinctive from sacrifices from our perspective. Of course, when we talk about money, sex, and power, we have to talk about, well, Eckel, the famous line, greed is good. And Jesus' comments here are apt, and they come right out of Leviticus, that nobody can serve two masters. You can't serve both God and money. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight, out of Luke 16. What does Leviticus teach? Our responsibility to sacrificial giving. Gee, how about that? Absolutely different from what our culture thinks is most important. So we are also to be distinctive people. This is one of those famous lines out of Leviticus. It runs through the rest of First Testament teaching, but you'll also notice it throughout Second Testament teaching in the New Testament. I'll just give you a couple of these stories. They're fascinating stories. Luke chapter 5, for instance. Here you have Peter, who has been fishing all night. Okay, now remember, he's a fisherman. So he's fishing all night, and he comes to the shoreline, and he's mending his nets. And Jesus says, why don't you go on out in the water again and throw your nets in the place that I tell you to throw them? Now think about this from Peter's point of view. Peter's thinking in his mind, you preach good, you heal people, I've seen you turn water into wine, all cool stuff, man, but you ain't a fisherman. I can just think, because that's what I'd be thinking if I was Peter. So he does what, all right, Lord, as long, so he does, and of course he comes back with a big haul. And what does he do? Any single one of us, what would we do? I'd have a contract in hand. Hey, Jesus, tell me where the fish are, man. We'll go 50s on this, right? No. What's he do? He comes back and falls on his face. And he says, get away from me, for I am in the presence of God. Wow. Acts chapter 5. What happens when you start messing around with money? Ananias and Sapphira. They had personal property and they sold it. Nothing wrong with any of that, but they lied. They lied as to how much they were giving. And of course, this being at the beginning of the church, there was an example being made here, and great fear fell upon all who heard it. That's not mentioned once, by the way, in verse 6, but also in verse 11 twice. 1 Thessalonians 4, God has not called us for impurity, but for holiness. 1 Peter chapter 1, he who has called you as holy is also holy in all your conduct. And again, going right back to Leviticus. So all that we're finding out in the Second Testament is already resident coming out of Leviticus. The issue of abstaining from sexual immorality, control your own body in holiness and honor, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 says. When we talk about money, sex, and power being the three major concerns really throughout all of human history, we shouldn't really be too surprised at this, because we see it all the time. What's the end result to this? What does Leviticus teach? What does Second Testament teaching take into account? Holiness. What does that mean? You're supposed to be different. There's an internal restraint necessary. You're supposed to restrain yourselves by the power of the Spirit and the implications of the Word as you read it. We talked about priests a couple of weeks ago. I'll just mention again this responsibility that they had to the issue of power. They literally were the go-betweens between God and man. They were in a position of power. Guess where I'm going to go next? The issue of power is huge. So when you start reading the First Testament accounts of this, Leviticus, go all the way into the Second Testament, James says this, show no partiality if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, sit down at my feet. Wow. That's an issue of power. And so the question then becomes, when you're at a dinner party with your wine glass in hand, are you looking for the next person who can really get you up the ladder? Are you really wanting to get past the person who's standing in front of you just so you can talk to somebody more influential? Share power positions with people. This is a huge issue for us. And I think about that especially as a Euro-American who is interested in looking forward to giving up positions of power to my African-American brothers. This is an important issue for me, actually part of the succession plan for Comenius. We've actually started that process where we start considering what do the next 10 years look like and how do we begin to think about that. And my interest in all of this would be to hire a younger African-American man to help him through a PhD process and to allow him to become the next executive director and take over this responsibility, to allow people to be in positions of power that have yet to be in positions of power who have been shunned in the past in our history. So the issue of sharing power positions, very important, very practical stuff, again, right out of Leviticus. So go back to this picture again. How are we supposed to be in the world but not of it? So here we are, people of Leviticus. They are placed right here in the middle of these two power brokers, two powerful places and positions in the Middle East. And now the question then becomes, how are you going to respond to those positions of power? Do you accommodate, compromise, or cooperate? And I suppose, as I've suggested here, it really depends on how we define those words as to how we're going to come to some conclusion. My concern is probably more with the first word than anything else, but this is what happens to us. We become accommodating to the principles and the power positions around us because we see this as a way to simply get along with other people or to be accepted by the culture or whatever group we're interested in being accepted by. So, when we talk about accommodation, this is what accommodation looks like. To be distinctive. Distinctiveness, while anything can become an addiction, habit, or vice, we're not talking about entertainment, food, drink, standard of living. Those things, while they can become addictions, are not the issue in Scripture. Here are the issues in Scripture. Seeking friends who are rich and powerful because they are rich and powerful. Proverbs 19 says everybody wants to be friends with a rich man. Why? Because they're rich. But guess what? The poor person, it goes right along in that same passage, the poor person is left out because they don't have anything to offer. The question then becomes for us, what do we give to somebody who can't give back to us? Living with more than we need and not giving to those in need. Do we see people in need that we can help? Are we prompted by the Spirit to give? And if so, how are we going to do that? What process will we follow to make sure that that happens? Or using our position to curry favors, helping, keeping others down. We see this all the time, and every single one of us hates it. Doesn't matter what political position, social position you take, we hate it when we see that other people are currying positions of power simply by paying them off with bribes, or in some cases just giving them positions so that they can get a payback later on. This is what it looks like to accommodate to the culture. This is the issue of money, sex, and power. So, let's talk about some examples out of Leviticus that actually give us some positive statements of how we ought to be living. One of them comes right out of Leviticus 19, out of this gleaning concept. Now, if you haven't heard about this before, I'll just give you a quick summary. Verses 9 and 10 in Leviticus 19 says that if you own a piece of property, go and harvest it, it's your property, but leave the edges and anything that falls on the ground while you're harvesting, leave it there. Allow then the poor and the stranger to come in and harvest the rest for themselves. This is called the gleaning principle. That is, gleaning in the sense that you are not taking from somebody else, you're allowing them to come in and work for it. And we could talk about the difference, for instance, between welfare and workfare, that kind of idea, which is essentially what this is, the gleaning principle in Leviticus chapter 19. So I wanted to give you an example of this here in Indianapolis. There's a place down on Brookside Church called the Isaiah House. Here are a couple of friends of mine, Kevin and David. And what they've done at Brookside Church is that they have created Isaiah House, which is basically a house that allows returning citizens coming out of prison, and they have immediately when they come to this house a place to stay and a job. So immediately coming out of prison, the two biggest hurdles that anybody has, a job and a place to stay. And that's what Brookside Church is doing. This is just one example of a gleaning principle where, hey, look, we've got enough. We want to help other folks. There's a constant discipleship that's going on in this particular place. Kevin, my friend to the left, he's one of the very first people in the country who has actually been tagged as a faith-based parole officer. In fact, on his flak jacket, right in the center on his chest, is the name Jesus. And on his business cards, he has written Agent of Redemption. On the other side, David Cedarquist is the pastor down there at Brookside. Another friend, and great guys, do great work down there. We're asking ourselves the question, okay, how are we going to be different from everybody else? What kind of distinctiveness can the church have in this culture in which we live? Here's just one example in Indianapolis. Leviticus 19 again, here's a second positive distinctive. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. So how do we treat another when we are given a position of authority over them? One of the big questions I think that we all struggle with is the issue of banking practices. In one way or another, we have really struggled with this, I think, as a culture. Certainly in the area of finance and financial literacy. So there is a group that's just provided, provided Comenius a space out in Greenfield. Coffee is the nonprofit. It's called Community Outreach for Financial Education. This is a group that has been organized out of a for-profit bank. They have now trained 1,600 financial literacy teachers who are training people around the United States about how to take care of their money so that the bank doesn't. How to better manage the money that they have because of the things that they don't know that are going on in banking systems. And it's not like somebody's trying to pull the wool, it's just that nobody knows it because nobody talks about it. So these folks have come to be a player in Indianapolis and actually have been tremendously successful in the kinds of things that they're doing in this nonprofit. But of course, you know, Mark's talking, so Mark has to at least show you this. This is an important film. Get past to the profanity if that's an issue, understand that's there. But this movie is a very important movie, Hell or High Water, starring Jeff Bridges, some really great names in this. Great story, but all the way through the storyline is the issue of Leviticus 19. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. Constantly, and it's all about the banking industry. Very, very interesting, very powerful film. I highly recommend it if you're into those kinds of things. One more example of this positive nature of Leviticus and Leviticus 19. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, bear a grudge against him, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Even this morning, as we're listening to Pastor speak about the disciples, think about what you're hearing here. You have a tax collector, Matthew, who is currying favor, or has in the past curried favor with the Roman government. You have Simon, who carries this dagger, which is called a Sicarii, which is 5 to 7 inches long, which is used to stick between the soldiers' 4th and 5th ribs and wipe them out in crowded marketplace situations. And the same discipleship group. Can you imagine having a Bible study with Simon and Matthew at the same time? Sorry, that just kills me just thinking about that, you know? They were in the same group. That's pretty cool. Political and social differences don't matter. Love your neighbor as yourself. Our real interest ought to be oneness out of John chapter 17. 3 times in John 17, Jesus says, let my people be one, that my people be one. My people will be one. And one of the ways that we do this in Indianapolis is our radio show. This is Dr. Posley from Antioch Baptist. He was on a few days ago in the radio show. We were discussing this issue about black and white concerns. Our concern specifically for the inner city. That's where he works. His concern for the suburbs. That's where I live. He said, we need to do a better job of unification. I want to work with you on these kinds of initiatives. So we were having a great discussion about that. You can go hear our interplay on the websites that we have available. This is what Leviticus means by distinctiveness. How are we going to love our neighbor? And it doesn't matter who our neighbor is, what they believe. So, a final word. The general legislation of Leviticus shows that all of life is lived under the watchful eye of God. And as a result, it makes no artificial differentiation between what's holy and what's secular. A holy people will, by their lives, transform mundane things into beautiful and acceptable offerings to God. That's our job. The underlying aim of the teaching is to ensure that God's holiness will be able to regulate and direct every area of human activity. The character of these ordinances shows that all aspects of life under God are sacred. There is no secular. There is no secular-sacred divide. There is no, this is the world's and this is God's, because all is God's. He has made it all. He sustains it all. He will bring it all to culmination. No secular. Everything is sacred. A few final words, and perhaps before I go to those, let me just suggest some of you are interested in some books I bring from time to time. I brought a couple commentaries this time. I hope that you'll avail yourselves of. I think they're the two best as it relates to very practical and yet explaining important and difficult words and passages. This one actually is the one I was just quoting from, R.K. Harrison's The Book of Leviticus. This is from the Old Testament Tyndale series. And this one is the New International Commentary in the Old Testament. This is Gordon Wenham, and one of the great commentaries in Leviticus. I highly recommend them both for your reading pleasure, or to have on your shelf when you are reading Leviticus and wonder what in the world does that mean. So some final comments. The problem of compartments, silos, false secular, sacred dichotomy begins its solution in Leviticus. To understand that there's no secular anything begins with our study of Leviticus. God cares about all of the world. Let me just pause here and say, you should praise Jesus right now that I am not reading to you from Leviticus chapters 14 and 15. You would be totally embarrassed. I would be totally embarrassed to be reading those chapters to you out loud in a mixed group. You will need to go read them on your own. Thank you very much. I refuse to read them to you. In fact, there is a passage in Leviticus 21 that talks about how the priests were to be physically whole. That's a passage I don't want to read out loud either. Why is that? Because God's concerned about all of life. All of life. There's not one iota of it that He doesn't care about. All morality is legislated. Let's get over this legislating morality bit, okay? Morality is legislated at the stop sign, baby. All right? At the stop sign. So when somebody somewhere declares something right or wrong, you're legislating morality. I don't care what it is. Some rule, some law, somebody's legislating it. In order to understand Hebrews, the New Testament as a whole, we have to understand Leviticus. You cannot understand the book of Hebrews unless you get a general understanding of what in the world is happening in this book. Number 4, key doctrines depend on Leviticus, such as substitutionary atonement. What does it mean that Jesus died as a substitute, that He willingly gave Himself up as a sacrifice? And His atonement didn't just cover our sin, it cleansed our sin. And then First Testament laws are the least studied parts, I think, of the Scriptures. So unfortunate. Next week we're going to talk about Deuteronomy. We'll bring this up again. It is the most rich universal resource, however, for understanding how we ought to live in this life. Fantastic stuff in the book of Leviticus. I highly encourage the reading of it, much less the pondering and reflection over it. Final thoughts, question or two here at the end. Did you know that educators tell us we're supposed to wait 30 seconds? You know how long 30 seconds is? See you next week. Oh, you do. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
When we what's the talk radio a lot? Christian radio. So they speak of secularism a lot.
Yes.
So is that
Yeah.
Is that not right?
The question has to do with secularism. Secularism is one of those isms that people kind of latch onto to kind of blame for a lot of ills in a culture such as ours. And what folks mean by that is basically living a life without God. So there's no interest or permeation by God at all. He hasn't spoken into the world. And I think that's what most Christians say or mean when they talk about this term secularism. It isn't, however, an appropriate term in the sense that we should really look at life as a whole under God's rulership, and everything is sacred in that sense. But that's what they mean, something separated from God. Thanks for that. See you all next week. Sorry, man, did you